Hello, welcome everyone. It's Friday. That means it's time for lunch with friends and strangers, brought to you by Carolina Public Humanities. My name is Max Owre, Executive Director of Carolina Public Humanities, and it's one of the funnest things I do is getting to spend an hour talking about really interesting people with really interesting people. Before we begin, I want to thank our sponsors, the Cotton Market Group at Morgan Stanley, Carolina Meadows, a retirement community at Chapel Hill, the North Caroliniana Society, and we'd also like to thank the General Alumni Association for publicizing and promoting this event and many others. Our partners are wonderful. I know Paul has can always drop information on some of our sponsors if you're interested in their goods and services and who they are and what they do. We can always give you links to those. We also want to thank you for coming to our humanities programs and to go to humanities.unc.edu to see more information on upcoming programs, including our seminar tomorrow on the Book of Revelation. We can still take you in virtually or online, real. This is Bart Ehrman doing the Book of Revelation tomorrow as an Adventures and Ideas weekend seminar. So we have information again on that at humanities.unc.edu. And to remind folks that we're in the middle of a wonderful roster of talks at Flyleaf Books on Wednesdays at 3:30. The Humanities in Action series is dedicated this semester to issues of misinformation and threats to our democracy. Difficult subjects, but ones we need to talk about. So join us on Wednesday when Daniel Priest will come and talk about social media and democracy. But enough about the future. Let's talk about the past. And let's bring up a colleague and good friend of the Humanities program, Professor Cemil Aydin, our friend today. Come on in. And hello, Cemil, welcome. How are you today?
Thank you. Wonderful to be here. Good to have greetings to everyone.
Great. And we will put information. We don't read your whole CV here because we want to get right to the thing. We'll put information on Cemil's work and his research. I just also want to say that Cemil has done wonderful work with Carolina Public Humanities in the past, including a whole seminar on the Ottoman Empire, which I still recall fondly and forms the basis of my own personal knowledge here. Without further ado, Cemil, do you think we should introduce our stranger to everybody?
Yes, and this stranger, of course, is a very familiar name and a very important person in modern world history, Mustafa Kemal Atatürk. And I consider, I picked this biography because there is a lot of interest in the modern world. How did we establish the modern international order? And what is the attempt to create a world without empire? What is a nation state? And he is right at the beginning of that transition from the world of empire to the world of nation states. And so for the 2/3 of his life of 57 years, exactly 2/3, he was a citizen of an empire. Then he became a soldier to defend the empire. And then right in 1919, he decided that the empire is not working. And he became a leader of a nationalist movement. And then his name is now, together with Woodrow Wilson, probably is considered, or many other nationalist leaders like Gandhi and Sun Yat-sen and Nkrumah, as someone who formulated a vision of a new world based on nation states and majoritarian nation state populations.
Yeah, he's one of these names that I think a lot of people who are familiar with 20th century history are familiar with the concept father of modern Turkey. You know, and I think you bring up a really interesting point, is to understand what that means is that there is modern Turkey before that is the Ottoman Empire, and it's a very different thing as to what comes out of World War I, and certainly we'll get into that life story. I also love that you have given us this picture here from Time magazine, because when I teach my world history courses, these a lot of times, you know, Americans are somewhat insular and they don't realize just how famous these people were. Time magazine was the most popular magazine in the United States, and if you showed up on the cover of Time magazine, that meant something, right? So he has a reputation that is international, but also there's a great amount of mystery. Why do you think it is that people don't, I mean, besides just general lack of knowledge about Turkish history, why is he not known as well as some of the other giant figures that of the first half of the 20th century?
I mean, he's known, of course, in certain regions of the world, maybe not in America, but there's something also very fascinating. I found that American diplomats and American publicists, including American Journalism magazine, became crucial in his reputation as a modernizing, secular Western figure. And this is a big contrast because in just at the beginning of the third part of his life in 1919 to 1923, when he became the leader of a republic, American public opinion was mostly negative towards the modern Turks and modern Muslims. They called them the terrible Turk, and it has something to do with the plight of the Armenians and the ethnic cleansing of the Armenians. There was a lot of Christian solidarity, and so the Turks as the worst Muslim. So if you think about 100 years ago today, when you think about Muslims that are hated by the Christian public, Turks will be the number one. And he manages to change that image, and he tries it on purpose to turn this idea of a terrible Turk, which will be symbolized by a documentary told by Walter Cronkite in 1954 called The Incredible Turk on Atatürk. And that documentary exists on YouTube. And it's related to his attempt to be the father of the liberation of Muslim women, changing the alphabet. That's why I put this. And the Time magazine, as well as American diplomats, are crucial. So one of the first biographies of him is actually by an American diplomat called Atatürk and Jefferson, way back in early 1930s.
And so the choices you made in these pictures, when we look at this picture on the left, these are the type of sort of images that are meant to that help change the image of Ataturk in the West as well, right?
And as the whole Turkish nation, right? So from a very negative perception in early 20s to mid 30s is overwhelmingly positive, both in Europe and America as a kind of a modern westernized nation, Muslim nation.
Well, that's fascinating. Let's get to some origin stories. So like everyone, he was born. And he was born in town here, right here in Salonika. What can you tell us about Salonika at this time in 1881?
Salonika is a part of modern Greece, but when he was born, nobody could have predicted that. 45% of the population was Jewish, and Jews were most loyal part of the Ottoman Empire after the Muslim majority population. And Turks were about 25, and Greeks were only 15, and the Bulgarians were very close to that. So the Salonika became a Greek city during the Balkan Wars, where the Greek armies reached Salonika and occupied it. It could also have been the Bulgarian armies, it could have gone both ways, and actually there's some sort of controversy. But it was a very cosmopolitan city. So imagine he's growing up and he's seeing synagogues, churches, Catholic and different Christian denominations and mosques every single day in his life when he's walking to school. And he thinks this is how empire and the natural life is in a city. But that also makes his Muslim identity very strong, right? If you are, the empire is a Muslim majority, the Sultan is Muslim, but he's part of a Muslim minority in a majority non-Muslim city.
So you mentioned the cosmopolitanism of it, and if I'm correct, it's the Dima, which is the ruling on people of the faith can practice their religion. How did that, but he's in the minority of the sort of majority religion of the empire. He's in the minority. So how does that play out, the religious life, and what that cosmopolitan and multi-religious upbringing was like for him?
So this is an old custom that partly comes from old Muslim empires, but we should note that the Ottoman Empire already eliminated non-discriminatory taxes on non-Muslims. So there used to be a tax taken, but that was already eliminated by 1850s. And then in 1869, there's a citizenship law, so that every member of the empire, from Palestinians to Bulgarians or Greeks, they are all citizens, equal citizens. Yet there is still some sort of a perceptions of different religious communities. And I think that, in some sense, identities, despite the attempt to create equal citizenship, identities of being Greek, Bulgarian, Jewish, Muslim, Christian get confirmed. And the Christians ask to pay a special tax to be exempted from the military. That kind of reproduced this tax on non-Muslims, ironically, even though they shouldn't have done that.
So it's interesting what you say, and I think we're gonna touch on this quite a bit, because that from the Western centric view of the Ottoman Empire, it's only looked at from as a decline, the sick man of Europe, and you really point to some interesting things in that the Ottoman Empire itself was a self-reflective, reforming institution that was already going through its own, driven by internal needs, not driven by external pressures, going through its own reforms, and so.
Yeah.
He's growing up in this era. Let's take a look at Salonika at this time, and this is an early picture here we have of the family.
Yes, that's his father died when he was 6 years old. The mother is Zubeyde. There is a sister, and the others are cousins.
So this is right here.
Yes, he's a young Mustafa Kemal with his mother, and the city looks. You still see the minarets. But you can also see the church tower and the kind of symbols of the synagogue. And it is a prosperous city. Commercially, was very important. So this is not someone who grew up poor. I mean, there's also a misconception. Ottoman Empire had many problems, but commercially, financially, they were prosperous in some ways. And the cities were very vibrant. I mean, Istanbul, for example, had 200,000 non-Muslim population around that time, and many of them carried foreign passports. So this is, it was called the sick man of Europe for various reasons, because it couldn't catch up with the rivals. But this was not
also a good excuse. It's also a good excuse to steal land, right?
Yes, that's part of the problem. But it's not a third world country in some ways. Yeah.
Yes. So what about the milieu? What about his home life? You say comfortable surroundings. Where was he in the social strata of
it's a lower middle class. So in some ways, the Muslim populations will incline towards the government position. So the commerce, business are dominated by the non-Muslims. But that's also kind of a structural imbalance, right? That if the political bureaucracy privileges Muslims, and then many Muslims will then imagine to be a soldier or a commander or a bureaucrat. But we do know that there were about 3,000 high-ranking non-Muslim bureaucrats in the empire, according to one of my friends' count, which is much higher than the number of high-ranking bureaucrats in the British Empire from non-Christian background, right? So it was a very different type of empire, in a way more inclusive. So you could see let's say in the foreign ministry or Ministry of Justice in Istanbul, there could be Greek, Jewish, Armenian bureaucrats working together still in this period. And things will get very dark and gloomy after World War I, and there's a tragic end to this. But I think when he was growing up, he couldn't have predicted that this empire will collapse. That's why he dedicated his life to become a soldier to defend the empire.
Yeah. So speaking of that, so he, like many Turkish young men at this point, and I assume mostly young men, are going to have opportunities, despite the cosmopolitan nature of the society. They will have opportunities for national service. You did just mention, of course, that you didn't have to be Muslim to have these access to government positions and whatnot. But the military, was that particularly a Turkish place to go in the military if you were from a cosmopolitan city like Salonika?
Yes. So it seems that the military ranks were more Muslim majority. So around his time, 20% of the empire were non-Muslim.
So how old would he have been?
But in the military, it was 95%. Well, 5% non-Muslim, the rest were Muslim. And there were a lot of Arabs. And this school that he went to, military academy, is today in Macedonia, Bitola. So he also, all his life he actually lived until he came to Istanbul, lived in cities that now part of different European countries, not Turkey.
How old was he when he attended this academy? And is this the premier military academy, or are there other military academies?
It is a military high school. So you enter into service at the age of 13, 14. And then by the time he's 19, he actually became already politically active. So in the 19, he's in the military college. And then he joined the opposition movement. So I also found it by accident that his 57 years of life divides very well into three 19-year periods.
I noticed.
And the number 19 appears in his life many, many times, and ironically.
Yeah. So his first, so we can put this in his first 19 years are the formation of his, does he maintain close contact with his family? I just always like this, when people leave, we sort of leave the family behind, but.
His father died, and then I think in the next stage, this is going to be very important for him, is that during the Balkan Wars in 1911, 12 to 13, his homeland or his city will become part of Greece. And his parents will become refugees, so they will come to Istanbul. And I think there is one point in his life when, during the Turkish War of Independence, when he defeated the Greek armies. So in 1912, his city will become a Greek city, Greek occupied.
Is this what we see on the right here? Is this Salonika falling, or? Yeah,
just Salonika is falling. So in 1908, he becomes a part of a group that will try to create a constitutional modern republic while keeping the monarchy. And in 1908, his party will make the constitutional revolution. And the picture on the right depicts the Lady Liberty, the Ottoman Muslim Lady Liberty, whose chains are broken by these revolutionaries in 1908. So this is some sort of a French revolutionary symbolism, but instead of a French woman, this is the Muslim woman, is liberated by the fez-bearing Muslim Christians and Jews who are all part of this idea of an Ottoman nation. And there are actually, figures are very European, they're angels, but in the background there are mosques of the city. So there was a lot of optimism that the new ideology will save the empire, but the opposite happens because of European colonialism and also the secessionist Balkan nationalism. This optimism doesn't last in 1912-13.
And of course, I should have noticed that's the famous Hagia Sophia now.
Yes, that's in the background. At that time, it was a mosque. And
exactly. So one question about the reform movement: why was the military? This is a somewhat liberal reform trying to create a constitutional monarchy. Why was the military, who we often think of as being more conservative, at the forefront, and what were the influences that would lead military officers to support those reforms?
So I think Ottoman Empire already had a constitution in 1876, just 5 years before he was born. But there was one sultan which was very disliked by the educated elite, who thought that constitution has to be suspended. People are not ready for the constitutional government, because he thought Ottoman Empire they called it like 19 Irelands. There are 19 provinces with different ethnic majorities and differences. So in order to control the secessionist nationalism, he thought there should be some sort of autocratic rule without constitution until people are ready. The constitution wasn't canceled, it was suspended. And then people like Atatürk, who were believing in democratic constitutional participatory government, they thought this sultan is giving Turkey a bad reputation. He's not doing a good job. So they then supported the constitutional revolution. So they became military, then helped the constitutionalists to restore the constitution.
Was there a sense
but immediately afterwards,
was there a sense with the sort of slow law, well, not just slow, sometimes very quick loss of elements of the Balkans, and the sense of a sort of shrinking presence on the European continent with these wars? Was that a matter of the military seeing we're losing because we're rotting inside, or we're not doing the reforms inside more? Was there a relationship between the military fate of Turkey and the desire for reform in the military?
Yes, exactly. I think so. There are a couple of ways to save the empire, and the military thought that the Sultan is failing to save the empire. And I think initially the constitutionalists thought that if there's a constitution, then the Christians, I mean, they meant the Greeks mainly, Greeks and Armenians will not want to get out. And they will remain loyal. Macedonians too. But despite the constitutions, Greek, Macedonians, and then eventually Armenians wanted to get out. And I think the Balkan Wars is a great blow to that optimist constitutionalism. So the Balkan Wars happened after the constitutional revolutions, when the empire was seeming very strong, but it seemed they weren't strong enough to defeat the coalition of the Balkan countries, the Serbians it's like a mini World War One before World War One.
Yeah, and of course we know that all of those Balkan states were very much being prodded on or supported by some of the other empires. This is an imperial struggle. These Balkan states have nationalist aspirations of their own, but Russia has an interest in a weakened Ottoman Empire. Germany has an interest. And some support I know the German support for the military. We're going to get to World War One, and the way that, of course, the Ottoman Empire ends up on the side of Germany. And of course, the 20th century changes our perspective on all of that because we sort of blend all of this together. Can you talk about how that developed and maybe where Mustafa Kemal was with?
Yeah. So after the Balkan Wars, there is a picture of him in the Janissary clothes. Can I analyze?
Yeah, sure. Which slide is that on?
It was slide 5
okay.
with the map. Just before World War One, after Turkey loses against Bulgaria, Greece, and then contemporary borders of Bulgaria and Greece are formed, Atatürk was appointed as a military attaché to Sofia, the Bulgarian capital.
Okay.
He's there, and this picture I find it fascinating. I mean, this is 6 years before he became the leader of a nationalist movement that will eventually destroy the empire or end the empire. But in a party, the costume party, they're hosted by the Bulgarian government, he decides to appear there in the garb of a janissary. And you have to order these clothes. It came from Istanbul by train. And this is a very bold, very imperially nationalistic move, because first of all, janissary order was actually abolished by the Ottoman government in a brutal way. So there was no janissary army. But secondly, janissaries have a very bad reputation in the Balkan states, like, especially in Bulgaria. If you go to the museum in Sofia, it's considered, because janissaries are recruited, early janissaries, from Christian soldiers, like Bulgarians, Serbians, Croats. So as a military attaché, going to a party with this clothes is politically very incorrect, to put it that way. And then maybe it's, but I mean, he has good friendship with the Bulgarians. I mean, he grew up with them too, right?
So he could be saying, despite the fact that your grandfather's brother might have been kidnapped and ended up in a uniform like this, I'm going to wear this at an official costume party.
Official costume party. But then, this is just before World War One. So when World War One starts, then Turkish government make this crucial mistakes, partly to recover the lost territories in the Balkans, even though they are very safe in the Arab lands. So they don't, they could have kept their Arab lands if he hadn't joined the war. But initially they wanted to be part with Britain, but Britain rejects their offer. And then they decide to join the war with Germany. And Mustafa Kemal is a soldier in that war, first in Gallipoli to defeat Churchill's armies, and then in the Palestine front, but eventually defeated by the British in that front as well. And when the war ended, of course, it becomes the general who fought to save an empire, but then who was defeated. And then his third part of his career starts. I think around that time in 1919, he decides that saving a cosmopolitan empire will be futile. Instead, he merges ideas of Woodrow Wilson and Lenin and others to create a kind of a Turkish Muslim majority empire. And there's a lot of references to Woodrow Wilson when he starts his movement. And 1919 is also considered the Wilsonian moment, because 12 of his Woodrow Wilson's 14 points directly refers to Ottoman Empire. It says in the Ottoman territories, we need to have a referendum, and whoever is the majority will have the self-determination. And he thinks Muslims, but as a category Muslims, not Turks and Kurds, our majority, maybe we get a deal, Wilsonian deal, to create a Muslim majority nation out of an empire. But the interpretation of Wilsonianism at the Paris Peace Conference is opposite. They say that no, you can't do that. We need to have a Kurdish state, an Armenian state, and the West, Turkey was supposed to go to Greece. Italians have a place, French has a place. And actually, Prince Philip, who just died at the age of 99, his father was a commander of a Greek army, and his uncle was a Greek king at that point.
Wow.
And the Greece invaded, so his former city homeland now became part of Greece, then invaded Turkey in 1919, and that's when he started on May 1919, the Turkish War of Independence in
Yeah. And
that
so,
became
you know, what he envisioned was the opportunity to take the cosmopolitan Muslim idea of the empire and turn it into this modern self-determined state. But the Allied powers say, well, no, we want to create Arab states, but they're not ready yet. So we create the Mandate territories because there's that great sort of paternalism in that, otherwise known as colonialism. And
yes.
so how now in 19, let's back to World War I a little bit, because in that era, of course, there are some, this is the and in before World War I, this is the era of already some obvious the tragedies in Armenia and whatnot. So how was the idea of national identity and self-determination among the Turkish people, how was that gaining ground and seeing themselves as Turkish as opposed to being part of a larger Ottoman Empire?
Yeah. No, I think he was a soldier during World War I. And during World War I, Armenians were recruited together with the Greek citizens of Turkey to fight for the war. So there were Armenian soldiers in Gallipoli, for example, to defend Turkey. And but in the Russian front, part of the Ottoman government, or the Ottoman government, decided that the Armenians might collaborate with Russia, but they are paranoid perceptions. And they used the war as an opportunity to kind of do an ethnic cleansing that turned into a genocide eventually, to remove the Armenian populations from Eastern Turkey, as well as from Western Turkey, where there was no Russian threat. So it also shows that the Russian threat is an excuse to remove them to Syria. And many of them perished on that way. I mean, this is wartime conditions. There are no highways and roads. Many people had to walk. But one reason why he was picked to be the leader of the nationalist movement against the invading armies is that Mustafa Kemal's name wasn't associated with the Armenian genocide. I think there was one decision that he was not there. That he wasn't directly involved. So in a way, because there were initially, immediately after World War I, Istanbul was under British occupation. There was Allied occupation, and some of the Ottoman leaders were put on trial for crimes against humanity. But his name wasn't in that list, and I think that he started the movement. But if you
I got this slide right here. We'll talk about him as a nationalist leader, right?
Yes. So it takes from they don't accept the Sèvres Treaty, which is kind of Versailles Treaty for the defeated Ottoman Empire. He starts the Turkish nationalist movement with a parliament in Ankara, that forms a government, and his military campaign financed by the Indian Muslims with donations and given arms by the Bolsheviks, and with their own, of course, know-how, defeated the Greek army, had diplomatic achievements, making treaties with France and Russia, then eventually convincing the British to rewrite the Treaty at Lausanne. Lausanne's anniversary is coming next year, and this is the Lausanne Treaty. And in Lausanne Treaty, they get this realistic deal with contemporary Turkish borders. This is a Greek leader, Venizelos, signing the treaty with İsmet İnönü. But there are let's say three very controversial decisions they make as a bargain. One is that there is no agreement on an Armenian homeland. So the Armenian demands to come back, to right to return, is rejected. And Britain and France betrayed Armenians at that point. They don't insist on this. So Armenian claims are not negotiated. Second, they decide on a full population exchange. So this is where they are signing that all the Greeks in Turkey will go to Greece, and all the Turkish-speaking Muslims from Greece, all Muslims in Greece will come to Turkey, with some exceptions. The Greeks in Istanbul, and some Turks will stay. So you can see the empires basically is ending. They're creating the homogeneous nation states. And the third one relates to the Palestine question. It's around that time, Palestinians also telling our Turkish leaders is that mandate is a new form of colonialism. Unless Turkey let Palestinians go, the mandate cannot start, because Palestinians were the free citizens of the Ottoman Empire. So the Turkish government has to say, I renounce all my rights and claims over Palestine or the Arab lands. so that the mandate can start. Actually, there were some attempts by the Palestinians to say, don't say this, so that the mandate and the Balfour Declaration shouldn't start. But they think that realistically, they cannot get anything more than
So
what
let's get back to Mustafa Kemal for a moment. What was his, I mean, he was signing off on all of this. Does he agree with this? Was he conflicted about any of these decisions?
He was in very close contact with Ismet Inönü, who signed on his behalf. Every day they will telegraph.
So the notion of the, you know, let's make Turkey Turkish, let's make Greek Greek. This is very much he's signing. He agrees with all of these decisions and sees the sense in them.
Yeah, actually, at the end of, there's one saying, I couldn't find the record, but it could happen at the end of his victories against Greek armies in 1922. His mother tells him, Mustafa, remember Salonika, our hometown? Why don't you just take your armies and go there to take it back from the Greeks? And then he tells his mom, like, Mom, no, that's it. We can't go back to these old borders. That there has to be something realistic, that the Greek invading armies have to retreat. There's a population exchange, but forget about Salonika. That's not coming back. So there is some sort of realistic notion that the new world will be a world of nation states. And around that time, he does two things. I mean, this is his only wife. It only lasted 1,000 days, from 1923 to 1925. Very educated.
How did that end?
7 language. It seems like as a political leader, he wasn't ready for that kind of a domestic life of family and children.
Did he ever have children?
They ended amicably.
Did he ever have children?
No, never. They were adopted children, but never children.
And what is going on in the picture on the left here? Is this
on the left is very important. So he's giving a speech after he declared the republic. He ended the Ottoman dynasty, but kept a spiritual caliphate. A member of the Ottoman dynasty was kept as a spiritual caliph of all Muslims. And he made speeches arguing for the abolishment of that caliphate. So the caliphate was abolished not by colonialism, by the Turkish parliament, saying that in the new world, we cannot have that kind of a transnational institution for all Muslims. So this was the declaration being democratic caliphate, and he abolished that. Turkish parliament abolished that. So, which is very important for the formation of the modern world and modern Turkish Republic.
So this is the him in that moment abolishing the caliphate. Let's talk about the reasoning behind that. It sounds like you had mentioned early on, we were talking about how he was admired for some of the, I guess people would say, the rationality that he brought to the government. And what are the impulses? What are the Republican philosophical ideas that are animating and that can tie together things like resettlement of peoples and abolishing the caliphate?
Yeah, I mean, his Muslim nationalism, of course, is unquestioned, right? His Muslim identity, from early childhood of Salonika until he died, is clear that he's creating a Muslim majority nation state. Later on, he will call that Muslim majority Turkish, and it becomes the source of the Turkish and Kurdish crisis, because Kurds were initially considered part of that Muslim nation. But if you call them Turkish, then the Kurdish population will begin to question that, ethnically they are Muslim, but they are not Turkish. But he, from his childhood onwards, he was very interested in European philosophy, French positivism, German materialism, and he believed that Republican nationalism should be the form of the future political order, and all human societies will have some sort of a peaceful world order if they believe in science. And he also believed in Western civilization, and he began to use that idea of Western civilization and the Turkish membership to the Western civilization to change the negative image of Turkey, because even though they have sovereignty after Lausanne, he still feels very insecure that this is a very colonial world and Turkey is a Muslim nation. And he had they are aware of this kind of Christian prejudice towards Turks as a racialized other. But by Westernization and modernization, he defeats that prejudice, or he tries to defeat that prejudice in the minds of Europeans and Americans. And the women's reform, unveiling of the woman, the change of the alphabet, all the revolutions is partly what he believes, but also partly appealing to a European public opinion.
What's really interesting what you're saying as a, as a historian of France, I'm very familiar with French republicanism. And I think of French republicanism had the reverse effect on women's liberation in France. I mean, it was French republicanism was held up as a reason not to give women the right to vote until 1944 in France. And then, of course, the French republicanism was incredibly hostile to religion. So I see something interesting in Kemal in Mustafa Kemal, in that he is promoting Muslim identity, but also enacting kind of a harsh reform on the religious authorities themselves. Is there a relationship between these?
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, he's a Muslim reformist, so he tries to reform Islam from within Islamic tradition. He thinks that Islam is harmonious with science and modern beliefs. So in the French Republic, he's an admirer of the Third French Republic, so the idea of a republic, and he perhaps was inspired by the anti-clericalism as well. For women's rights, he gave women's rights, women right to vote earlier. There was an International Women's Congress in Istanbul in 1934.
Wow.
And kind of a month before that, they announced women's right to vote, and there was some sort of woman elected as mayor and early on. And then he believed in women's equality, but also he used this to remake Turkey's image. So there was a lot of confusion about his vision, and I used how he was seen as a Muslim hero. This is an Indonesian newspaper talking about him as the Lion of Islam. It's almost like a Muhammad Ali, the boxer, but it was a kind of political hero.
Despite diminishing the role of the formal church in the Caliphate.
So some ideas I think will come a little bit late. So the radical secularism, I think, will become more obvious to other Muslim publics after the Alphabet Revolution, which is 1928. This is the early 1920s. But I put this New York Times article. I mean, even European press was very confused. So when he got a divorce, they thought he got a divorce. This is after caliphate was abolished. They thought he got a divorce so that he can marry last caliph's daughter and declare himself the caliph. I mean, there was some sort of a New York Times. New York Times doesn't get everything right, but this is so wrong in all levels. But it also shows the confusion in the American perception of him. They thought he's a Muslim hero. Why did he get a divorce? Is he going to marry the last daughter of the Ottoman Sultan so that he becomes the Sultan or the Caliph himself? There were offers to him with that, but he insisted on the form of a republic because he didn't have a son, which was actually lucky for Turkey that the transition to true democracy could happen. There was nobody claiming his position in the Turkish Republic after he died in 1938.
One thing that's interesting about the comparison to French republicanism is this fear of communitarianism. Did he want to reduce did he see the Muslim authorities, because there is no Muslim church, but did he see Muslim authorities as being somehow pulling people away from this new Turkish national identity, and that's why wanting to reduce the role of the formal church at the same time as promoting Muslim identity?
Yeah, and he didn't. So he didn't go as far as Russia. There was some sort of Russian Soviet Revolution as also unveiling campaign, but they banned many things. In Turkey, many of the reforms were done in a very moderate way. And actually, recently, after Afghanistan had its all unfortunate turn recently, there was a lot of talk on his friendship with the king of Afghanistan in the 20s. Amanullah Khan. Amanullah Khan and Iranian Shah were visiting him often, and they were great admirers. And according to the rumors, he told Amanullah Khan is that don't copy me in everything I do, because your population might not be ready for my radical secularizing reforms. Be gradual. If you're not sure whether he really said that, we don't have any Afghan records of it.
Yeah.
But it also shows how much of other Muslim monarchs and leaders admired his reforms. They didn't see his idea of a republic deviating or leaving Islamic transnational Muslim identity, that he was seen as a hero. And in that
Cemil,
context, one of our grad students worked on how much of beauty contest was very important for his promotion of a new Turkish identity. So there was a universal beauty contest in Belgium, and one 18-year-old Turkish girl became Miss Universe. And he really welcomed this young girl with state ceremony, and then promoted this as a success of his reforms at a Muslim.
And what year would that have been?
1934.
And so it's very interesting because is this what we're looking at in the middle here?
Yeah, in the middle. That I think he is with Miss Universe, and
wow. And
the other pictures are her. She was sent to Egypt and other places to show, which I think in a way culminated with the Cold War Turkish-American alliance that I mentioned, Walter Cronkite documentary. But there's also his friendship with the American ambassador Joseph Grew is very important. I think he has a sense of reformulating Turkey's global image, and he seems to be very successful, partly with American support, with the documentaries they made about him, American documentaries.
And this here is the Afghan king coming.
Yes.
You mentioned. So
yes,
it's curious. Let's just situate in the 1930s, and I do want to remind folks we want to stop at a certain point to give you time for questions. So please put your questions in the question and answer buttons down at the bottom, and when we're finished here in a few minutes, we'll take on some questions from the audience. I wanted to situate the 1930s clearly in European history. There's a lot going on. And Turkey seems to just be this sort of there's a sort of a silence around Turkey in the 1930s. How was he dealing with the incredible ideological war between communism and fascism and the growing power of Germany and Germany's, Hitler's incredible fascination with the East and desire? I mean, what's going on in the 30s, and how is he playing that diplomatic game?
No, this is a fascinating question, because Turkey officially tries to Europeanize and Westernize its republic, right? That they are invested in the idea of the superiority of the European civilization when Europe is going through this conflict between communism and fascism. He's trying to stay out of it. I think he and his top bureaucrats, they think that the Ottomans joining the war on the side of Germany was a mistake. They could have stayed neutral. That's why they will stay neutral in World War II. They won't join any part. So that one lesson they learned from World War I is that don't take a side, let them fight, try to keep your sovereignty. Yeah. But there was one figure named Richard Koothaven Kalergi. He was a father of pan-Europeanism. He's an Austrian aristocrat who believes in this idea of a pan-Europe. And they invited him to Ankara, and he said that Europeanness is an open concept, that the Turks can be European. And they were very pleased to hear that so they were still very invested in the idea of Europe and the Western civilization. So in the 30s, they tried to keep that belief open in their mind. Yeah.
And they maintained good diplomatic relationships with both the USSR and Nazi Germany and whatnot. And so he like everyone, like I mentioned at the beginning, like everyone he is born, and like everyone, sorry to inform everyone, he does of course pass away. Will happen to us all. And in 1938, how was it? I assume that there was great national mourning. What follows his death, and could you do a little counterfactual about what might have happened if he had lived through World War II?
There's all kind of counterfacts we wouldn't know. But
of course.
The person who replaced him was very close associate of him, Mr. İnönü. But when he died, they created this great mausoleum. So because his ideas, his reforms became the official ideology of the Turkish Republic. And this is almost like a Greek temple, right? It's a giant statue. So they had to create a sacred image of him as a great visionary. I think there's a question on that too, right? That he's almost a sacred figure there. Wherever you go, you could see statues. And
is this in Ankara? This,
This is in Ankara, yes. His mausoleum is very often, frequently visited.
mhm.
And then from then on, there in other countries in the Middle East and other places, there was always a debate about his legacy. So the people who want to modernize and Europeanize will always say positive things about him, and people will be critical of the kind of extent of westernization, will then criticize him. So he became a kind of part of a domestic ideological debates in Iran, in Egypt. So in Egypt, he's in a stamp. Obviously, Egyptian leaders liked him and wrote books, but then also in Egypt, Muslim Brotherhood started criticizing him as early as the 1940s as being too extremist and secularism as a mistaken policy.
So I would assume that the Arab Baathists might have been admiring his secularism, and then at the same time, Pan-Arabism doesn't include Turks, or does it? Or
yeah, so that's why I put this picture. This is Joseph Groove talking to him in 1932.
Okay.
And in the middle is Atatürk's adopted son, is a woman who has a PhD from University of Geneva. I find Joseph Groove is very important. In 1945, just at the beginning of the Cold War, Groove is the acting Secretary of State. And when the Cold War starts, what America, first of all, Turkey then joined the American side in the Cold War. But second, more importantly, what America does is that against the Soviet Union, they promote Turkey and Atatürk as a model to other Asian and Middle Eastern countries. And they say, Turkey is on our side, and Atatürk is a great leader. It's better you be our side. Don't go to the Soviet Union. So there's an attempt to create little Atatürks in Syria, in Egypt, in Iraq. And for various reasons that fails. I mean, that's actually the golden age of US-Turkish intellectual alliance in the early Cold War. For about 10 years, they formed the Baghdad Pact, and they're all kind of interesting things. But then his legacy becomes an issue, right? And if you're promoting him in Syria or Egypt, so that those countries also became American allies, and people talk about who was he. So there's a debate on his legacy just immediately beginning of the Cold War in American social sciences and in Arab publics. Yeah.
Would it be fair to say that you can excuse the behavior of a Nasser or someone like that, or excuse the behavior of a Saddam Hussein or whatnot, if you portray them as in the model of a secular leader like Atatürk? And let's talk a little bit.
But there's one issue, of course, is that the secularism is fine, but his policies or reforms have done within one party in an authoritarian manner. So that was one issue. That's why America in 1950 kind of asked Turkish allies to move to a multi-party, truly pluralist politics. And they were very pleased to see that his legacy wasn't tarnished. So even though when there was a new party that wasn't his party, that new party was even more Kemalist than him, than the other parties. So in Turkey, his legacy is unquestioned, even by Erdogan. I mean, Erdogan is a Kemalist too. So he doesn't, he may disagree with some of his policies, but he's not, nobody can go against his legacy in Turkey. But there are, of course, controversial parts, this contradiction between secularism and democracy, whether some of his policies were wise to go into this kind of cultural colonization, people consider. Was it necessary to make the holidays Sunday? Change the calendar, instead of Friday, or change the alphabet. Was it a good thing? I mean, people still make the argument that the Latin alphabet is easier to learn. It increases. Turkey has a very high literacy of 98, 99%. Just so that he's still being debated very intensely.
So we're going to get to some questions from our audience, but I have just a couple points. One is Atatürk, the name. When does this begin, and what are the significance?
So Turkey also has a surname revolution. That means that everybody will have a surname instead of using their father's name as their surname. And during that time, the Turkish parliament decided that they will give him the surname of the father of the Turks. So Atatürk is the father of all the Turks. And Then there was during the International Women's Conference I mentioned in 1934, when Egyptian feminist Huda Sharawi visited Istanbul. He was very impressed with his reforms and women's rights and other issues. And she said, "Oh, he's not only he shouldn't only be called as father of the Turks, but he should be called the father of the East." Atashark.
Wow.
So there were at least he had feminist allies in Egypt and other places who wanted his name be even grander, that instead of the father of the Turks, the father of
it's ironic that there was a surname revolution, that you would pass on that surname to your children, that his surname was father of the Turks and he didn't have any children to pass the name on to, so there's only one.
There can only be one. I think that's the idea.
And the other little point I wanted to ask before we get to these questions is Ankara as the capital. I'm curious about the decision to move the capital from Istanbul, and what was that all about?
Well, when Turkish Parliament was opened in 1920, Istanbul and Ankara, Istanbul was under occupation. Ankara wasn't under occupation yet.
I see. Okay.
But there is also one intellectual reason, is that Istanbul symbolizes still a very cosmopolitan empire. Istanbul's population still had 20-25% non-Muslims in the 20s and 30s when he was alive. The numbers will get reduced, people will leave, things will get worse for Greeks and Armenians in Istanbul. Some of the soccer leagues, for example, early soccer leagues in 20s and 30s have Armenians and Greek teams in the Turkish soccer scene. So there's also this kind of a division of what Istanbul symbolizes. And you can create something new in Ankara, kind of a tabula rasa.
Absolutely, it makes sense with that. It makes sense with the idea of republicanism, right? You want to just sort of create this Republican identity, Republican
But
state.
he died in the old Ottoman palace in Istanbul, Dolmabahce Palace. He died there.
That's where the palaces are, right?
Yes.
All right, let's get to some questions. Jonathan Gerard, thank you for this, Cemil. It's absolutely fascinating to get more information on this, giant of history. Jonathan Gerard has a question for you. I said, could you say more about the relationship between Turkey and Palestine? You referred to Palestinians, but I thought this meant Jews until after 1948 or later. He gives an example of the Jewish paper was called the Palestinian Post until the UN created Israel. So what was the identity of the Arabs who lived in the Mandate territory at that time? And I would add, what is their relationship to Turkey even at that time?
So the Palestine, current Israel and Palestine, there were Jews there, but the majority population were Palestinian Arabs and Christians. And they were upset with Balfour Declaration greatly. But so the Turkish government, Turkish Sultan, for example, met Theodor Herzl many times, but they wouldn't endorse that kind of a Zionism, right? That it was part of the Ottoman territories, Palestine. But they had a very Mustafa Kemal had a very interesting relationship. He fought in the Palestine front. So he was sympathetic to the Palestinian critique of Balfour Declaration. But when they went to Lausanne, Turkey had to defend itself for its oppression of the minorities, right? That they oppressed the Greeks and the Armenians. At that point, they found Turkish Jews as an ally. In fact, they took the chief rabbi of Istanbul to Lausanne conference. To make this one case is that, yes, we had issues with the Armenians, but it was their fault. But look, we have another minority, Jews, and how great we were getting along. So they used this contrast, and I think in that context they also didn't feel like they have enough power to say anything, do about the Arabs left. So the borders between Syria and Turkey is very artificial. It was initially the French from Syria came to some of the Turkish cities today, Antep and Adana, and they came with Armenians, and then Turkey decided that the French would withdraw from Adana and Antep, but then they didn't push any further. They didn't want Aleppo back, for example. They could have claimed Aleppo as well. In that context, it seems like Turks told the Arabs that whatever problem you have with the new European colonialism and the Mandate, I can't help you. Good luck. That kind of ended their cooperation, even though they may have any sympathies. But it's a very complex issue on that transition, how there's a Palestinian Syrian committee that is that diverge into different nationalism. I guess the the question refers to that. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I guess in this dynamic, it's a matter of being an advocate for other people, but also self-preservation of what you're trying to do in your own state, right? And that at this point, it's focusing on really creating that strong new Turkish identity, that new strong Turkish state in the 1920s and 30s.
And
that's the priority.
I mean, Turks never learned that, of course, that just a couple of months before the Turkish parliament opened in Syrians had their own parliament and a constitution, and it's a kind of constitutional monarchy they created, and the French went and destroyed that. So there's a very good book by Elizabeth Thompson, I highly recommend, called How the West Stole Arab Democracy. It talks about the kind of hopes for a Syrian Palestinian democratic kingdom, which was crushed by the invading French armies. That's your topic, right there.
Yeah, there you go. Well, we'll cover that one in another session. I'm pulling some questions sort of out of chat here, and I'm going to do them a little bit out of order. Brian Keelef would like a little bit more detail on the steps that Ataturk took to come into power. Like, how does that transition from military to political work?
Yeah, that's a great question, Brian. I mean, why was he picked as the leader of the Turkish nationalist movement? So the Turkish official historiography, of course, have to say that Ataturk has nothing to do with the Young Turks, that the Ottoman Empire was defeated, and the Ottoman Sultan and the government signed a defeat document. Boris Johnson's grandfather became a minister at that point. It was called the British Kemal. Is another Kemal, Ali Kemal, and they basically wanted to create some sort of a small Turkey under British protection. Mm-hmm. And they were still asking some sort of Istanbul being a spiritual caliphate and its connection. And then at that point, then he moved with the excuse to be the military inspector to the Black Sea town of Samsun to start Turkish War of Independence. But now we know from historical record that he was asked to go there on behalf of the Young Turks, who had a secret committee saying that we surrendered, but we're not going to surrender. I mean, we officially surrendered, but we're not going to give our weapons. Things are going bad. And at that point, Greece invaded Smyrna, and they panicked, the Greece, because they thought then they would lose everything if there would be a Greek Hellenistic empire. So they asked him to go to Samsun to start the movement. And initially, the movement was very moderate. It was very Wilsonian. Actually, in the first year, there were references to Woodrow Wilson to be the kind of guardian of a mandate. They said they could accept the mandate only if it's under American protection. But then gradually they abandoned that idea. Yeah. And say that America still be biased and it's not going to help us. And then they formed a parliament. And once the parliament is formed, he became the leader clearly of the new parliament in Ankara. And the parliament in Ankara inherited the Ottoman parliament. So the Ottoman parliament declared the National Pact in March, but invaded by the British army. Parliamentarians escaped and then came to Ankara and reformed the new parliament. So there's a kind of transition, and he then clearly emerged as a leader of that movement.
And that's that veneer of legitimacy that you're taking the element of constitutionality that was in the previous regime and bringing that in. It's handing the baton over in a sense.
Yeah, I mean, Brian's question, of course, might also indicate there's a big debate on what happened to Enver and all the Young Turk leaders. So the Young Turk leaders didn't disappear. They were supported by the Bolsheviks. They were still doing this kind of in exile international campaign, but two of them were killed by the Armenian figures and nationalists as a revenge for the Armenian ethnic cleansing. And then Enver Pasha was killed by the Bolsheviks. So he was initially supported by the Bolsheviks, but when he changed side, he died. So that's also an interesting turning point. At some point, when Mustafa Kemal won victories against the Greeks, he didn't need this old Young Turk legendary leaders, and then he himself emerged as a symbol of a new vision. Cut off from the Ottoman past.
We have to call our day to an end here. We don't want to get everyone, I don't want people to miss their actual lunch. But let me just talk a little bit about legacy. Brian Key Left mentions 10 years ago, Ataturk was a demigod in Turkey, and how about now? Sam asks, is Erdogan trying to roll back the changes that Ataturk had put into place?
So in the contested legacy, I think there are points where instead of completely erasing it, rolling back some aspects of his legacy at the expense of the others. So what Erdogan and his party does is that they are still based on this idea of a homogeneous nation state that is not questioned despite their imperial nostalgia. And they only find some of Ataturk's policies objectionable. And one of it was immediately changed when there was a transition to multi-party politics. That during his time, there was a decision to change the call for prayers from Arabic to Turkish, to kind of nationalize religion. That was changed way back in 1950. There were many other secularizing policies with the multi-party politics. Some of these things were reformed and changed. So you can say, yes, some of his legacy is being pushed back by Erdogan government. But overall, of course, you have to think of Erdogan as a kind of a synthesis between what he perceives to be the best sides of the Ottoman imperial past, Islam, and Kemalism. And there is a lot of Kemalism in this too, right? That the Turkish nationalism is the solid core. And Erdogan's base, I mean, in Turkey, nobody would go against him. Maybe, of course, there's one issue, since you referred to Hagia Sophia about 10 months ago. Hagia Sophia was converted from museum to a mosque. That is, of course, is an interesting challenge to him. So you can see in one aspect of his legacy, because he's the one who was behind the decision to convert it from mosque to a museum during a renovation. And it was clear, I mean, everybody was furious when one of the religious leaders said that Hagia Sophia relies on the foundation deed document of Mehmet II who conquered the city. And whoever violates this deed document should be cursed, or something like some sort of a negative. Well, Ataturk is the one who basically said that, look, we need to make this into a modern museum. So you can see areas where some of his legacy is basically overturned and challenged, and there's a lot of discontent about that too.
But still will appear on official documents. Still will appear. They're not taking down the mausoleum.
No, that's possible. Yeah, the neo-Ottomanism, what people call neo-Ottomanism, does not deny him, his legacy, his achievements, nor it denies Europe. It's a misunderstanding. Neo-Ottomanism is not an anti-European thing. It's basically try to think of Turkey as still its kind of idea that they merged the best of East and West.
Right. In a way, you could say if it's neo-Ottomanism, the Ottoman Empire was one of several empires that was involved in the major, diplomatic exchanges of the 19th century. Neo-Ottomanism is a way of saying we want to resurrect that element of us being a major player. Is that a fair sort of way of?
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
And I was very surprised in the summer when I was visiting Istanbul. I saw that they immediately after the collapse of the government in Afghanistan, I mean, everybody then created this nostalgia of even the people in Erdogan's party of how great Ataturk is, right? So the kind of unfairly, the failure of Afghanistan becomes a confirmation of its positive legacy. And then they went back to the stories of him giving advice to the Afghanistan king. I disagree as a historian. I mean, the tragedy of Afghanistan has nothing to do with that. I mean, Afghanistan had a constitution. It is true that Afghanistan's constitution was inspired by Turkey. In 1923, they had a very beautiful constitution inspired by Turkey and India. And actually, one of the reasons why the Amanullah Khan failed is that he was copying Ataturk, and when Ataturk was keeping the caliphate, the kind of pious populations will see constitutionalism, republic, well, not republican, but constitutionalism and the caliphate hand in hand. When Ataturk abolished the caliphate, then his ally or his friend in Afghanistan got into trouble, because then people say that your reforms inspired by Ataturk might lead to extreme secularism. So he
Yeah.
may have actually damaged his friend's position in Afghanistan. And it was Amanullah Khan was overthrown in 10 years in the
Well,
late
I'd say
20s.
Afghanistan has been such a complicated and so many factors going into that. I think we can not blame Afghanistan on Ataturk, right?
Yes. No, I wouldn't do that either. Yeah. No,
Well,
he did, by the way, he did send an immense amount of experts to Afghanistan. So the Kabul University's medical faculty, many of the universities were actually started by Turkish professors. So his contribution to Afghanistan is immense. We can't deny that. It's clear.
Right. Well, I want to thank you, Dr. Cemil Aydin, for coming and joining us today with bringing an absolutely fascinating figure that I mentioned we all kind of know, but now we know a lot more. So thank you for that. Very briefly, can you tell us what you're working on right now with your research?
Yes, I am trying to write a 20th century world history that is partly inspired by Michael Hunt, our colleague who wrote the book, World History After 45. But before he passed away tragically very early, he and I were talking to make it the whole 20th century world history, that I was supposed to write the first half and he's the second half.
Okay.
But I want to keep this promise to his legacy and want to.
Well, we love and admire Michael and miss him tremendously. So thank you for doing that. And we look forward to hearing about it. And you're always welcome to come and talk to our audiences about it. One more time, let's thank Dr. Cemil Aydin. Thank you, Cemil.
Thank you. And I hope to see you in person. I missed the community. And
yeah, exactly.
Thank you.
I am a 3D person, I swear. And as is everyone else out there, we all miss you. Reminder about our programming. Tomorrow, Book of Revelation with Dr. Bart Ehrman. Wednesday, we have our, of course, Humanities in Action. And next Thursday, we have a very special program. Dr. Claude Clegg has released a new book on Barack Obama. And there'll be a book signing and a little interview with him and open for questions at Flyleaf Books and online. So plenty of opportunities to engage with us. Thank you, Cemil. We'll see you soon. Give our best to Juliana, and we'll see everyone out there soon enough. Have a good weekend, everybody.
Have a good weekend.
Bye-bye.
Bye.